I was raised in the central part of Michigan, in Mount Pleasant. My father was a professor at Central Michigan University, and I also had grandparents in Clare that I'll talk about briefly. And so I had a connection with that part of Michigan as well. I also spent a lot of time in the Traverse City area, just vacationing sorts of things, and other parts of northern Michigan. But in writing this book, I found myself in parts of northern Michigan that I had never imagined actually existed. I had never set foot in Montmorency County, for example, before working on this book. So that was one of the nice benefits of working on it. I got to see pretty much all of the nooks and crannies of northern Michigan. After I finished at Central Michigan University, I went off to the East Coast, to the University of Pennsylvania, to work on a PhD. And that was in ancient history, in Greek and Roman history. With that, I progressed from Maine to Utah to Berkeley, California, to teach in university, and did teach for about 30 years, a little over 30 years in university, mostly Latin and Roman history and some archaeology. So I was a professional historian. And so when I got retired, we decided to be more active in Michigan, because I had, my wife and I had purchased the log house that my great grandfather had built outside of Clare as a pioneer in 1888. So we reconnected, or I reconnected with Michigan. My wife, raised in California, has become an honorary Michigander in the midst of all of this. But the historical work with the cabin and with the Historical Society in Clare County got me more and more involved in the history of northern Michigan. And specifically, I became interested in gangsters, as I'll tell a brief story about that in the presentation.
And so, Robert, would you like to tell everybody where they can get your book, where they can purchase it? I know I've had several people ask me that question as well.
Well, you can buy it online at Amazon, and there are two ways to do it on Amazon. One is to order it from Horizon Books in Traverse City, and they also have the actual book there at Horizon. And the other way is to order it from Cleophile Books, the publisher. And in that way, you can also send me an email, and I'm always happy to sign the books that people want signed and put inscriptions in them. A great Christmas present here, and send you the book with a signature and a dedication. There's also a bookstore in Grayling that covers that carries the book, Tip and Mitten, it's called, and so you can get a book there as well. The jewelry store is sort of weird in Petoskey. Arlington Jewelers actually has some copies as well, not exactly a bookstore, but they do have some copies, so it would be possible to get it there. Try as I could to get the bookstore in Petoskey, Eakins, I think it's called, to carry the book. They were resistant. So you can always carry signs in front of the store demanding that they carry the book. But those are the easiest ways. There's some other places in southern Michigan, but those are the ones in northern Michigan. Outside of Clare, there are 3 places in Clare as well. Cops and Donuts, the famous Cops and Donuts in Clare, is carrying the book as well. So it's easy to get, and as I say, I'm happy to inscribe the book if you send me an email with your order asking me to do that. Thank you, Beth, and thank you to the Harbor Springs Historical Society for inviting me to talk about gangsters up north. It's a favorite topic of mine, as you might imagine, since I wrote a book about it. And here I am. That's me, Robert Knapp. You might actually be wondering how I got interested in gangsters in the first place. Well, it's actually a pretty simple story. My father was a native of Clare, and he worked as a soda jerk in Houghton Drugs downtown. He was working there the night of May 14th, 1938. A woman came into the soda fountain just to ask me for some ice cream. No flavor, just vanilla, as he recalled her saying. That's when he heard gunshots ring out from the Doherty Hotel across the street. Sure enough, murder it was. Isaiah Leboff, a person we'll meet again later, had been shot and killed by a disgruntled associate, Jack Livingston. Well, as kids, my brother and I heard this story a number of times with added background from our grandmother who lived close by there in Clare. Fast forward to 1995. I was in Clare rummaging around a yard sale when I came upon a box of old newspapers. There was a collection of newspapers from around the state telling about the murder in the Doherty Hotel. I remembered the tales from my childhood and became intrigued anew. As I read through the papers and examined the images, my innate historian kicked in. I was hooked. I had to find out more about these people and these events. So that's how I came to write the first of my gangster trilogy, Mystery Man, the story of that Doherty murder and its victim. I went on to write then about a major player in Mystery Man and a long-standing, upstanding citizen of Clare, a man named Sam Garfield, in the second volume of the gangster trilogy, Small Town Citizen, Minion of the Mob. Well, at that point, I'd sort of run the table on Clare gangster material, but had developed a keen curiosity about other gangster activities in central and northern Michigan. So, gangsters up north, mobsters, mafia, and racketeers in Michigan's vacation lands came into being. And that is the book I'm eager to share with you today. But first, I want to ask, why gangsters? I've explained my entry into the world of gangsters, but I am far from alone. Indeed, millions read about gangsters, watch gangster movies, and talk about gangsters among their families and friends. These men, and there were almost always were men, were downright nasty folks for the most part. Why are we captivated by these kinds of people? It's an interesting question, and there have been lots of different answers. But whatever the answer, the circumstances flowing from the beginning of Prohibition in the 1920s provided the environment for gangster criminality on a whole new scale. As this rolled out, this criminality, newspapers realized that sensational stories about robberies, murders, bootleggings, assassinations, betrayals, and such like were fodder for exciting headlines and stories that sold in newspapers. So the public feasted their eyes daily on vivid stories of criminality. The blossoming film industry was fairly quick to take up the topic for exactly the same reason. Although in their case, it was to sell tickets, not newspapers. The first gangster film came out in 1928. And it was soon followed by other movies. Particularly, the topic exploded in 1931 and the years thereafter. It really took off with Edward G. Robinson and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in Little Caesar, and James Cagney and the beautiful Jean Harlow in Public Enemy. And finally, there was a movie by Paul Mooney and Boris Karloff called Scarface, the story of Al Capone. Over the next almost 100 years, literally thousands of gangster films have been produced. Think of Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway in Bonnie and Clyde, or Robert Redford and Paul Newman in the rather lighthearted film The Sting, or the recent Public Enemies with Johnny Depp and the murder of public enemy number one, John Dillinger, in 1934. And of course, the most famous movie of all, Marlon Brando in The Godfather. But why do we like these gangsters so much? It's partly envy. Those guys know what they want and they take it. Partly it's misplaced awe. These guys live by a code of honor, are loyal, or they pay the price for disloyalty to their friends and families. In fact, they treat their families well. And even at times they perform good deeds to polish the gangster image. And partly it's just excitement at associating vicariously with people who can break the rules that bind all the rest of us. And then there's simply the fame factor. I'll talk about that when I talk about the myths and legends of gangsters up north. So here we are in Michigan. You're looking at the places where I've discovered truth or fictions about gangsters. Most of the spots are admittedly, some of the spots, not most of them, some of the spots are admittedly not up north at all. But all of the spots on this map are connected in some way with gangster activity up north. To the southwest, there's a lot of activity along the shore of Lake Michigan as gangsters come north from Chicago. This is practically a suburb of Chicago. Around Detroit, there are, of course, connections with the gangsterism rampant in the Motor City in Prohibition days. But I will focus mostly on the true up north. As you can see, there are lots of possibilities. In fact, let's start there. What better person to start with than Al Capone, the most famous gangster of his time? This is Heart's Ease, a fine house on Lake Michigan's Leelanau Peninsula. A local historian wrote about this place as a summer hangout for Al Capone and his cronies. The trouble is, the stories he was told seemed to all be fictitious. Al Capone never got this far north along the lake's shore. In fact, up and down the Lake Michigan shore, sightings of Big Al turned out to be fictional. For example, he was supposed to have stayed at Opitz's Hotel on Round Lake near Ludington. Or he was supposed to have had a brick house on the shore in Frankfort. Or he was supposed to be playing golf at Shields Resort on Lakeview Lake, which is near Lake Ann, southwest of Traverse City. And many other examples have been sworn to me by locals. Although the presence of Scarface up north, it seems to me, was entirely fictional, lots of other gangster activity was not fictional. It's worth noting, though, before we leave Al, that Al Capone did in fact vacation up north. The problem is it wasn't up north in Michigan. Up north Wisconsin was very popular with a number of Chicago hoodlums, Capone and his brother among them. He even had built, but never occupied, this retreat in that area. So enough of Al. Gambling always drew investments from gangsters, and up north was no exception. The wealthy resort area of Little Traverse Bay, which you know very well, was perfect for investment. In Charlevoix, the Colonial Inn catered to the resorters. Locals were not admitted. A fancy restaurant, lovely grounds, music and dancing, and the green room, as it was called, for gambling. A bit to the north, just outside Petoskey, Club Manitou catered to a little less elite crowd, but still locals were banned. Here, Slim Gerhardt took money from Detroit's infamous Purple Gang and built a nice spread. Again, there was dancing and dining and gambling and all the illegal liquor that you could afford. Here you can see an exterior view of the club as well as its dance floor. Just around the bay, exactly in your neighborhood, Harbor Springs, stood the Ramona Park Casino. The Ramona Park Casino sat within 100 yards of the luxurious Ramona Park Hotel. They were not owned by the same people, but really now, is it a coincidence that there was a gambling casino within 100 yards of a luxurious hotel? Probably not. And now you're undoubtedly thinking, well, what about the Grand Hotel? And you'd be right to think about this. From the very start in the 19th century, gambling was a steady attraction at the Grand. During Prohibition, there was a special room set aside specifically for gambling. Liquor was discreetly available at the hotel, even on the Grand veranda. Gangster involvement in Club Manitou, the Detroit gangster money, and in the Ramona Park Casino, Toledo gangster money, is well attested. However, John Coke at the Colonial Inn that I mentioned in Charlevoix and Stuart Woodfill at the Grand stoutly denied any gangster activity in their gambling. In fact, Woodfill, against all evidence, denied any gambling was going on at all. For him, appearances were more important than the lucrative reality of gambling at the Grand. What is certain is that one native of up north was up to his neck in gambling enterprises, even though Coke and Woodfill denied they had gambling in their establishments. This fellow, a native of up north, remained in gambling through his entire life. And this is Mert Wertheimer, who, along with his three brothers, grew up in Sheboygan. As a young man, Mert got involved in the gambling scene downstate in Detroit. The tentacles of his operations eventually extended into the entire Detroit area, south into Kentucky, east to West Virginia, south to Florida, and eventually west to legal gambling in Nevada. He invested in the Club Manitou. Maybe he had something to do with the Colonial Inn or with the Grand. We simply don't know. But we do know that he was a big enough fish to warrant kidnapping for ransom by fellow Detroit gangsters. The snatch wasn't quite as spectacular as this, but he was taken to a cabin on Burt Lake, and there he was held until he paid $50,000 in ransom money. It was the only kidnapping by gangsters that I came across up north. There was also bank robbery up north. Here we are in Hillman, a very small town west of Alpena. Two thugs came up from Detroit. They robbed the Montmorency County Savings Bank and lit off into a nearby swamp to hide out until things cooled down. Hundreds of locals, along with lawmen, surrounded the swamp and eventually caught one of the robbers. They never recovered the money, however. It was a story that caught the imagination throughout the state. Eventually, one of the robbers died, or probably was murdered by the other robber in the swamp. The other was captured and convicted. As I said, the money, however, was never found. Of all the gangster-related places up north, the Graceland Ballroom near Lupton in Ogemaw County is perhaps the most well-known. One-armed Mike Gelfand built the place in 1931. Although the sobriquet one-armed conjures up images of arm loss in a gangster brawl, it was nothing of the sort. In fact, the one-armed condition resulted from an accident as a teenager. Anyway, Mike took money he'd made in Detroit running, among other things, a speakeasy, and he came north. He built the Graceland Ballroom and ran it for a half dozen years in the 1930s. In Lupton today, sorry, I'm losing, sorry, just a second here. I'll get, my technology is giving me a problem. My technology is back on track. In the Lupton area today, many people will tell you that the ballroom and an adjacent set of small cabins were built for the Purple Gang as a rustic retreat. I could find no solid evidence that this ever happened. One person I talked with had actually worked for Gelfand at Graceland. She told of an encounter with a gangster. I have no doubt that tough guys came up north for a little bit of rest and relaxation, just like everybody else. All we Michiganders like to go up north if we don't have the fortune to live up there in the first place. And some certainly might have come to the popular dance pavilion, but these would have been random visits. The Purple Gang had no steady presence in the area. Indeed, by the time the Graceland opened, the Purple Gang was already done as a significant gangster presence. But the stories were great. So great, in fact, that a subsequent owner of Graceland decided to cash in on them. In 1957, Floyd Pastula created and pervaded a creative recreation of Graceland as a Purple Gang retreat and general gangster haven. He set up on the balcony a mannequin with a machine gun. And he offered such titillations as a concrete overcoat of the sort allegedly used by the Purple Gang to eliminate rivals. It all went up in smoke one December day in 1981, but it was fun while it lasted, and the stories of Purple gangsters in the area of Lupton proliferate to this day. So let's move on to the Mafia. Detroit's element of La Familia, the family, or Cosa Nostra, our thing, had existed from the late 19th century. Prohibition gave it the environment it needed to expand exponentially into all areas of crime and the rackets. Joe Uno Zerilli and William Black Bill Tocco, Black Bill is at the right, Zerilli is at the left, they emerged as Mafia copy de copy by the early 1930s. Leading a pack variously called the Detroit Outfit and the Detroit Partnership, these thugs pushed out a weakened Purple Gang and gained control of Detroit's underworld. But where to go for vacation? The answer was Higgins Lake and the Grayling area. At Higgins, Zerilli and Tocco, their families, they joined together in marriage, when they involved also another Detroit Mafia figure, Machine Gun Pete Corrado. So the Zerillis, the Toccos, and the Corrados all loved Higgins Lake and the Grayling area. They had, and for all I know, may still have, cabins on the east side of Higgins Lake. Joe Zerilli especially used his cabin on Higgins to entertain mob bosses from out of state, including Joe Profaci, the capo in New York City. Joe developed such a taste for Werner's ginger ale that he would take a case of it back with him when he returned to the Big Apple. I have mentioned Al Capone never being up north, as far as I could tell, but his sister, Mafalda, actually lived up north and died near Oscoda. Her presence there had nothing to do with gangsters. It had to do with living close to her only daughter and grandchild. But there she was, the sister of Al Capone in Oscoda and dying in Harrisonville. Well, A famous gangster who did make it up north was John Dillinger. He came north with another public enemy, John Hamilton. Now, the mission that they were on was a quick visit to Hamilton's sister in Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, Hamilton is one of only 2 gangsters I researched who actually came from northern Michigan. He was from Sault Ste. Marie. His early life hardly adumbrated his vicious gangster life to come, a gangster life that ended in a shallow grave in an Illinois gravel pit in 1934. Bootlegging. Now, bootlegging, this is the favorite cartoon that I found in all of my research. Bootlegging was one of the most lucrative activities for non-law-abiding citizens up north. Illegal liquor flowed easily from Canada along the porous United States border. Of course, the vast majority of it came across the Detroit River. That outlet was pretty much controlled by the Purple Gang, but wherever Canada and the United States came close, bootlegging thrived. The St. Mary River that ran from Whitefish Bay and Lake Superior into Lake Huron, actually it still does run there, was and is a maze of small islands. Although a detachment of the Coast Guard tried to stem the flow across the river, it was a losing battle as local men used their speedy craft to carry cases of liquor from Canada to points west. The quantity was never enough to interest big city gangsters, but it certainly was enough to supply the resorts up north with all the high quality liquor their residents required. Okay, now let's head south a little bit to Clare, the self-proclaimed gateway to the north. Gangsters are infamous for murder. Did they continue their murderous ways up north? I've mentioned Isaiah Lebov's murder by Jack Livingston as I began this talk. I mentioned it here again briefly, just to say that it is the only murder up north that I could find to investigate. And even this one is only problematically a gangster a gangster murder. You'll have to find out all about it by reading Mystery Man. And that's why I recommend to you that book, and you can check out all the details. Another spot near Clare brings up another interesting character. Harry Bennett served long and faithfully as Henry Ford's fixer and security man. Here he is with Henry Ford himself. Bennett himself was not a gangster, but he had very close ties to the Detroit underworld, especially to the Detroit Mafia. He used some mafiosi as security men in the Ford plants and was not above using mafiosi thugs to counter violently men demonstrating to unionize Ford operations in the 1930s. Here he is with Henry Ford himself. Now, Harry was married, actually it was his second marriage, to a quite beautiful wife, and he built for her a retreat cottage on Lake Huron, on the shore of Lake Huron, just north of East Tawas. Hardly luxurious, it certainly was comfortable. He enjoyed the cottage for a few years and then traded it to Henry Ford for a mansion in Ypsilanti. So now Harry needed another retreat. He created one on extensive property on Lost Lake in Clare County. So he had this extensive property in Clare County. Perhaps this place that Harry Bennett built is the only place that rivals the stories swirling around Graceland Ballroom in Lipton. Lost Lake accumulated stories just as Graceland Ballroom did. It has its own world of myth and legend. Supposedly, Harry Bennett built this as a retreat for and against gangsters. That's the usual story that's given. He had friends that he wanted to entertain, but he also feared his enemies. That fear supposedly led Harry to dig a moat around his house, put spikes in it, to set up various booby traps and escape routes, to have men posted with machine guns on the roof of his house, and to institute an escape plan that included flight from a specially constructed airfield nearby. These and similar stories circulate widely in Clare County. A fairly recent documentary about the Purple Gang in Clare County has repeated these stories. Unfortunately, they have little or no basis in fact. Indeed, Harry Bennett did build a house overlooking Lost Lake, but it has and had no machine gun emplacement on the roof, no escape down a booby trap staircase, no bulletproof glass in the windows, no bullet holes in the walls. It is a bit odd that the cement block walls, sorry, another technological problem here. Solved. Okay, it's a bit odd that the cement block walls are covered with an artistic layer of concrete and they're made to look like logs, but that's just aesthetic. It has nothing to do with it being bulletproof or anything else. There is indeed an airfield, and we know that Harry Bennett had a pilot's license. There is a moat, but there are no spikes. There is a bridge, but it is not booby-trapped. All this I know from touring the place with the groundskeeper and from talking with people who occupied the house after Bennett left. The source of many, if not all of the tall tales are the Boy Scouts who bought the property in the 1980s. They enjoyed scaring youngsters with tales of gangsters. Scoutmasters led the way with invented stories. These stories, in turn, seeped out into the community and became accepted as truth. This cautionary tale leads us to think about the many other fictions about gangsters that floated around up north. I cannot count the number of times I was told or read that a person's grandfather, grandmother, uncle, or friend swore that a gangster, most often Al Capone or the Purple Gang, had come into their lives in some fashion. Maybe they knew the house where someone had lived or hid out in. Maybe they had personal interaction with them, like fixing their car or cutting their hair or cooking a meal for them. Or maybe they heard of someone who had cooked a meal for them or fixed their car. I have suggested reasons why people might make up or even fabricate stories like this. Let me just share a couple with you. Example 1. My grandfather fished with Al Capone on the Saginaw River. Well, there has been a ton of research on Al Capone, and almost every hour of his life has been traced since he emerged as a leader of gangsters in Chicago in 1925. There is simply no timeline that allows Capone to be in Saginaw, and no reason why Al Capone would ever have gone there. If he wanted to float along in a leisurely fashion with his line in the water, he would have done this, and indeed he did do this, but he did it up north in Wisconsin. Example number 2. My grandmother in the Sioux fixed spaghetti for Al Capone. The usual text for this is Capone being in the Sioux to arrange for bootlegged booze from across the St. Mary River. There are at least 2 reasons to doubt this scenario. First, Capone was mainly a beer baron. That was his focus in Chicago, not a hard liquor gangster. When he did run hard liquor, his sources came from Canada, across Lake Erie or across the Detroit River, or even some of it was shipped west by train from the East Coast. It was uneconomical and unnecessary to get booze from sources in northern Michigan and ship it by boat, train, or truck all the way to Chicago. And there is no indication that the quantity of smuggled booze justified or indicated large-scale, big city gangster activity. Second, if Capone did want to arrange shipments from the Sioux, he would certainly not have gone there by himself on his own to do it. That was what minions were for. And third, Capone's well-documented movements do not allow time for a trip to the Sioux. Okay, so much for two good stories and their unlikely truth. Let's return to Clare for a moment. Why Clare again? Well, because here I have an example of how my suspicion about a gangster presence was, surprisingly to me, misplaced. I should have been alert to the possibility, since I had at first rejected the story of John Dillinger traveling to the Sioux, a story that turned out to be true. But when I was told that one of Al Capone's torpedoes, that is a hitman, had taken up residence northeast of Clare, I was highly skeptical. Joe Barnes was his name, and he supposedly had a retreat hideout for gangsters on his farm. Well, with a friend from the Clare County Historical Society, I went out and visited the farm. The present owners bought it from Joe Barnes's widow. They said that neighbors had told them about gangsters on the site back in the 60s when they had purchased the place. They told me that the stories included a visit by Al Capone, of course, Al Capone had to be there, who stayed upstairs in the bedroom of the farmhouse. The window there in the peak of the house is the window of the bedroom where Al Capone supposedly slept. Be that as it may, the most curious thing was the converted chicken coop. This had bunk beds in it and would have slept about a dozen men. There was also an apartment above the farm's garage. The owners also told me of a shack down by the lake and boats in ruins. So we hiked down to the lake, and sure enough, there was a fallen down tar paper shack with wrecks of rowboats all around. Clearly, this had been a resort, but for gangsters? I contacted a number of people who recalled Joe Barnes in the neighborhood. They themselves recalled a well-dressed fellow in a pinstripe suit and fedora who always seemed to have enough money. One person even recalled that Barnes had told them that he had a Chicago gangster connection, that he had been a driver for Capone. Now, driver in gangster parlance is almost always code for bodyguard. Okay, then in Clare, an ex-chief of police said that Barnes had worked for him in the 60s as the town dog catcher, and Barnes had said he had connections with Chicago hoodlums. Finally, the dispatcher of the Clare Police Department told me that she had heard Joe detail stories of his life as a gangster in Chicago. She was convinced by these stories that, indeed, Joe had been a driver for Capone. However, Joe had sworn her to secrecy, and she declined to give any stories to me, even though Joe was long, long dead. Well, it was time to do some more investigating. I looked at Chicago area newspapers, and sure enough, there was a Joe Barnes in Chicago. His real name had been Baraniski, which was easily Americanized to Barnes. He had run a speakeasy on the south side of Chicago, and he'd almost been killed in a gun battle with rival gangsters. He then enlisted with one of Capone's henchmen to work running a speakeasy whorehouse in Chicago. There, he met a young girl from Arthur Township in Clare County, which is where his farm is. Edith had come down to Chicago from Clare to work and had found her way into the role of a barmaid in one of Barnes's speakeasies. They married in 1928, and in 1932, they left Chicago, bought a farm in Arthur Township, and lived there the rest of their lives. Besides farming, Joe worked as the Clare County dog catcher, as I said, and at other times as a deputy sheriff in the county and as a constable for Arthur Township. He also converted the coop, acquired the rowboats, and built the tar paper shack. Perhaps these were just for visiting friends and family, but perhaps, just perhaps, they really were for Chicago gangsters who could come up north and have some rest, relaxation, and fishing in what was virtually a private lake. So a tale I thought was fabricated turned out actually to be likely true. So there you go. We've come to the end of Gangsters Up North. There's lots more to tell, but for now, I'll just thank you all for watching. And if you have any questions, then Beth can coordinate those and we can chat. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. That was wonderful. Let me find my book. We do have a few questions. I wanted to begin with a question from Cooper that asks if you know if there was any presence of Pretty Boy Floyd in Michigan.
Okay, Pretty Boy Floyd, I investigated, and he was involved in a bank robbery in Grand Haven, which by any stretch that I wanted to make, I could not make up north. It was a sort of Keystone Cops operation, but Pretty Boy Floyd was involved. But that's the only thing, the only event in his life that I could find in my material. So that's Pretty Boy Floyd.
Our next question is from Jana Taylor. She asks, how long did it take you to do your research for this book?
Well, I started the research for this book after I finished the book on Sam Garfield. So probably 2 years, 2.5 years, something like that. But I'd accumulated stories and thoughts and so on before that as I worked on the other 2 books. So it really was more than a couple years, but of hard work, it was about 2 years, 2.5 years.
Suzanne Pollock would like to know if you have any information about the Ponytail Club on Pleasantview Road, which of course was Club Manitou before it was Club Ponytail.
Well, I do, and Rick Wiles has written a nice article on the Ponytail in the Michigan Chronicle. But since it happened after Gerhardt was out of the picture, I really didn't pay much attention to the Ponytail, except to think of it as one of the number of nightclubs for teenagers up north. We always from Mount Pleasant went up to the Box in Houghton Lake, or over to the one outside of Cadillac. Can't think of its name right now. But the Ponytail was just like these other operations. But I never really spent a lot of time with it because it didn't have any gangster connections at all.
Right, yeah. Club Ponytail was more of a teen soda fountain club after the infamous Club Manitou. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about Club Manitou and Gerhardt up here?
Sure. It was really Club Manitou that got me started with Gangsters Up North. Again, Rick Wiles there in Petoskey was very helpful to me early on, and because he was very interested in the Manitou. And when I made a trip to Petoskey, we ran around and checked out the places. And I also had known of the Manitou very early on, because in writing Mystery Man, I had run across an account of a man's trip to up north, which included a stop at the speakeasy in the Club Manitou. He describes the door and the checking of identification and so on at the Club Manitou. So I was really interested in in learning more about it. It turned out that that Gerhardt was actually a pretty, what I want to say, not notorious, but certainly not a highly moral person. He was involved in a murder down by Detroit, which looked like, it was never proven, looked like it was a murder that was between rivals in the bootlegging down there. He fathered a child out of wedlock in a little town on Lake St. Clair. He generally was not a great guy. So he goes up north to Petoskey. And the question then is, where does he get the money to build Club Manitou? And we know that at some point, Abe Bernstein, one of the leaders of the Purple Gang, was involved in Club Manitou. And I think it's reasonable to suppose that the Purple Gang money thought it would be useful to invest in a gambling operation in northern Michigan. So that could be how he got the money to build what was quite a nice place, quite a substantial place. And so he opens it up, and he enlists as one of his helpers, probably also something of a bouncer, a guy named Fatty Bernstein, who was wanted for murder in Detroit. So whether or not he was actually related to the Bernstein brothers of the Purple Gang has never been entirely clear, but at any rate, he was a pretty hard-nosed guy. So he was there to help out. Downstairs was where there was the dancing. There was a band. In fact, thinking of the Ponytail, I actually corresponded with a person who had played band and who knew the stage there in the basement downstairs of the Manitou. Upstairs was fine dining, and there you could have a fine meal. So that was very much like the Colonial Club in Charlevoix, where the dining area was separated from the gambling area. In the gambling area, there were roulette wheels, a standard in these gambling operations, as well as card gambling. So you could go downstairs and have a drink and a snack there. There were chairs there in the room, and then there was a dance floor, a little dance floor, and a stage. And upstairs you could be fancier if that's what you wanted. And in either place, of course, liquor was available. Probably their main profit maker was liquor. Gerhardt, it's sort of the Club Manitou goes downhill precipitously in the late 30s. It may have had something to do with the end of Prohibition. I don't know. It might have been other problems, but it closes and opens and closes, and eventually in the late 40s, I think it closes for good. But Gerhardt then heads off for West Virginia, and he sets up another gambling operation in West Virginia, a place called White Sulphur Springs, which he runs until it's closed down by the feds. And at that point, he comes back to the Petoskey area, and he retires on the lake out there by Alanson, and just sort of lives happily ever after. People said he was a good neighbor. He actually pays money to have a little park built there in Alanson along the edge of where the railroad track runs. And he expired as an accepted citizen. So that's the story of the Club Manitou, but there were no murders or anything. These were these places, the club in Charlevoix, as well as the Manitou and the Ramona Casino, all kept out the locals and only catered to the wealthy resorters that came up mostly from Chicago, but lots of other places, Cincinnati, St. Louis, so on. So they really were, in a way, not part of the local life, and intentionally not part of the local life. The law people looked the other way. There were occasional raids by the state police on the casino and on the Club Manitou, but the local people, constabulary, sheriffs, and so on, seemed to figure that it contributed to the economy of the area, and so they weren't really interested in enforcing the laws. So that's a lot of carrying on about the Club Manitou, but
well, it's a fascinating topic, and I will note to everybody who is still listening that Rick Wiles' presentations that he gave us at the Historical Society several years ago are recorded and are something that we're hoping to get up on our YouTube page at some point. So like I said, visit our website and our programs page in order to see what we have posted so far. But we have some more questions, so I'm going to keep rolling. Marcia Ann would like to know if Frank Sinatra ever came to Ramona with the Chicago Gangsters.
No, not as far as I know. I do not believe Frank Sinatra made it into northern Michigan for any performance. I certainly didn't note any of that. His connections with gangsters tended to swirl around Nevada.
Oh, okay.
And Mafia connections in Las Vegas. At least that's what I've usually seen in the stuff that I've read. So as far as I know, Blue Eyes, we never saw him in northern Michigan.
Okay. A similar question. Mary Jane would like to know what activities went on at the Harbor Inn. And as I understand it, the Harbor Inn was Ramona Park, just renamed later on, I believe. But do you know anything specifically about the Harbor Inn?
The Harbor Inn is the hotel then on the shore. The casino is in back of it a little bit. The Harbor Inn, well, the casino was closed down for gambling. And a fellow named Boston came out and occupied the Seagull cabin at the hotel. And he ran a small-time gambling operation out of that place. And when the police raided it, raided him and the hotel people said, no, there's no gambling going on here. And then the police discovered that the gambling was being piped in from this Seagull casino into the hotel. So it wasn't taking place on the site of the hotel, but people were being kept up to date on betting on horses, for example, or on boxing or something like that, that was going on in the Seagull cottage. That was closed down as well. This is all in the 50s, I believe. And after that, when it became when the name change of the hotel occurred, then it was all on the up and up. I never saw anything indicating that any gambling continued after the 50s in the hotel, or around the hotel for that matter. But if anybody knows anything about gambling continuing, then I'm interested.
Wonderful. We've got a couple more questions here. Peter wants to know, he has a daughter and her husband who live near Ypsilanti, near a wooded property that was once owned by Harry Bennett. And they have a couple of cement log cabins that look more like hideouts. Do you know anything about those? Harry Bennett, Ypsilanti.
Sure. That house was actually built by Henry Ford. Bennett traded his East Tawas cabin to Ford for that house. And Ford was terrified that his son, Edsel, would be kidnapped, because in the 30s, the late 20s and the 30s, it was a prominent source of income for gangsters to kidnap the children of wealthy industrialists. So Ford was terrified of this. And Harry Bennett was actually as well. His daughter, Gertrude, he was terrified that she would be kidnapped. So the house there in Ypsilanti has elements that allow security precautions, shall we say. If there are cabins that look like logs, that would be exactly the same type of construction as the house that Harry Bennett built at Lost Lake. But I would be very skeptical that if they were used to hide gangsters or to do anything nefarious, aside from having a place for friends to put up friends. Harry was a very social person. So that's what I know about the Ypsilanti mansion. It was definitely Harry's, and it definitely had a tunnel to get out to the garage and a few things like that.
That would be a fun place to visit. Let's see. The next question, it comes from Cooper, and he wonders if there was any evidence of gambling at the casino on Harbor Point, which I can answer. Actually, there was not. It was called a casino, but there was absolutely no gambling there. It wasn't a casino in the typical sense. It just held public events. But the second part of the question is, Harbor Springs actually also has a colonial inn, just like Charlevoix. Do you know of any gambling or evidence of gangsters here?
The short answer is no. The hotel is the only place that I had any indication that the fine, upstanding community of Harbor Springs was involved in gambling. And you're quite right about casino. Casino just means a little house in Italian. And in Charlevoix as well, there was a casino that had nothing to do with gambling at all. It was just the name that was used for a cozy haunt sort of thing. To say once more about the Harbor Springs area, the hotel, the casino next to the hotel is the only place that I believe there was any gambling going on.
Right, there in Ramona Park. Yeah. Let's see. Vivian wants to know if you were aware that there is still some mafia connections in Detroit. She says it's very low key. My relative is related to those in the family, and he talks about them carrying guns to funerals.
I have no doubt that there's still mafia going on in Detroit. Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that for a minute. The mafia hasn't gone away, and they're pretty good businessmen in general, and so they're able to blend in many ways. But yes, I'm in Chicago, in New York, in Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland. There is definitely still a gangster, still a mafia presence. I don't doubt that at all.
Right.
I just don't know whether they vacation up north anymore.
Right.
The last I checked, the Corrados still owned the two cottages on the east side of Higgins Lake. And fairly recently, they had bought additional property, presumably for hunting, outside of, north and west of Higgins Lake. So they may very well still come up for vacationing, just like good Michiganders.
Let's see, we just have one or two more questions here. This one is from Ed. He wants to know if there was any connection between mob activity and the Central Park Grill in downtown Petoskey, which is now called City Park.
I did not find any connection in Petoskey except for the Manitou. Now, there was a lot of gambling going on in a lot of places. And in bars in particular, very frequently had card games going on in the back rooms. They probably didn't have roulette wheels and that sort of fancy thing, but for normal citizens in Petoskey or Harbor Springs or Ludington or Traverse City, it would not have been hard during the 20s, 30s, I don't know, maybe even today, I don't know, to find opportunities to gamble. We're not talking huge pots, but it went on. I wouldn't doubt, I have no reason, no evidence that there was gambling going on in this particular place. But if it was open during the 20s and 30s and 40s and into the 50s, then I wouldn't doubt that it probably had a slot machine. It probably had card games going on in the back. That's the way regular people gambled. They weren't going to Club Manitou and the Ramona Park Casino and the clubs in Charlevoix. They were going to the bars, which traditionally, in the 19th century, right on through, featured gambling as one of the reasons why men, and it was almost always men, went there.
Let's see. Natalie wants to know if there was any record of Capone's nemesis, Elliot Ness, vacationing in northern Michigan.
Yeah, Elliot Ness starts out in Cleveland and goes to Chicago and is a great self-publicist. There are lots of material in books written about Elliot Ness. It wasn't anything like the legend that Elliot Ness created. But my guess is, since he was in Chicago, he went north. If he went north, he would go north in Wisconsin. There's really not much reason for sort of normal folks to make the trip around Lake Michigan to northern Michigan, because they can go straight north, Milwaukee and on up, and get into exactly the same environment with lots of lakes and trees and so on. So my guess would be that Ness would, as Capone, would probably have gone north into Wisconsin rather than into northern Michigan. It was really, my understanding is, it was really the wealthy Chicagoans who had a tradition from the 19th century, actually, as you well know, of going up into the Petoskey area and having summer homes. But not your sort of normal run-of-the-mill people. I think they would be more likely to go north into Wisconsin, and I would count Elliot Ness among them. But I don't know for a fact. I did not run into any indication that he had made it into Michigan.
Right. We have some similar questions here. Asking if Al Gerhardt or any of those gentlemen who owned and ran Ramona or Manitou were ever thrown in jail in Emmett County.
Not in Emmett County, but Gerhardt got caught in two different operations. One was a counterfeiting operation in Detroit. That he and another fellow at the Manitou were involved in, and the second was it was reported in the papers as a shrub theft, shrub as in small tree, because Gerhardt went across Lake Charlevoix to Ironton, I think that's the name of it's the Ironton ferry. And there he was shot and wounded in a nursery. And so this became, he was over there trying to steal shrubs for whatever reason. Well, surely this was a bootlegging deal gone bad. He was ultimately convicted of theft and served for 9 months, a very short time, in Jackson, in the prison in southern Michigan. So he did not serve in a jail in Emmett County or Charlevoix County for that matter, but in Jackson. On the counterfeiting business, he also served a short time in prison, but he always got out. He always came back to the Petoskey area.
Well, I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. A couple of these questions you you already touched on. People are interested in if there was any evidence of alcohol smuggling with some of the cottages on Harbor Point here in Harbor Springs. The Walker and Bush families of St. Louis had cottages there.
Well, I think when you think about liquor in Prohibition, there are two different sources. One is homebrew, and the other is imported from Canada. Now, homebrew was widely made by farmers who consumed some and sold the rest. And local sheriffs and so on were regularly arresting local moonshiners. So this could be beer, was often beer, and it was also stills. It was also hard liquor. So this is what most locals would have been drinking throughout northern Michigan, throughout much of Michigan. It was much cheaper than the other whiskey, and probably safer because the other whiskey was usually cut hugely. I mean, 50, 60, 70% whiskey was, and then sold as pure. So if you really wanted to get drunk cheaply, and surely you were better off dealing with moonshine and beer from your local farmer than you were trusting gangsters selling you degraded and perhaps not even genuinely Canadian whiskey. So the wealthy people then who came up to the resorts, they got the real thing, or they brought it with them. So everybody that wanted liquor could get liquor in the during Prohibition. It was just the kind of liquor that you could afford that comes into play. I hope that offers some explanation.
So this is going to be our last question for the evening. Actually, it's two questions combined. Both Doug and Mark are interested in this. Doug mentions a tunnel in Harbor Springs where they would run bootlegged liquor down to the bay. And similarly, Mark mentions that there was rumors of a tunnel leading from the Manitou Club towards the bay.
Okay. If we have another hour, I could talk about. Here's the story. Well, first of all, yes, there is supposedly a tunnel from the Manitou down to the airport. Actually, is where it was supposed to be. I didn't know about this tunnel in Harbor Springs, but I have never found anyone who actually themselves experienced a gangster tunnel. Now, you set that beside the fact that gangster tunnels are everywhere. I mean, in Clare, for example, people tell you with a completely straight face that there was a 1.5 mile tunnel under a river going from a supposed gangster house to the Doherty Hotel. This is just as simply impossible. So tunnels are part of the mythology of gangsters.
Right.
Wherever gangsters are, people will tell you there are tunnels. Now, gangsters needed to get away. They absolutely did. But I know of no, well, I shouldn't say that. I know of one example where gangsters actually did use something like a tunnel, as opposed to just running like hell to get to their cars and speed away. So I'm not saying there's no tunnel in Harbor Springs, but I would be delighted to have somebody take me to that tunnel and say, okay, crawl through this tunnel. This is a gangster tunnel.
Right.
Because I've never been able to find anything remotely like that to do tunnels. But they're fun because they always appear.
Right, they're part of the whole, like you said, the mythology of gangsters up north, tunnels and speakeasies and all of that. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Robert, for joining us and for that presentation. It was wonderful. Learned a lot of interesting facts as opposed to just the myths. And we really appreciate you being here.
It's really been a pleasure. I would have much preferred, as you would have, for me to be there to be able to chat in person. But this I think this was a good option. I've enjoyed presenting my material. So thank you for the invitation.